It was a pleasant afternoon, and the horses grazed peacefully when White Bull first heard the screams. Turning from the herd he was tending, he looked back towards the massive village along the banks of the Little Bighorn. People were running, screaming. In the distance, he could now hear the faint cracks of rifle shots. They were under attack. White Bull leapt upon his fastest horse and rode back as far as he could. He didn't know it yet, but he was riding into one of the most legendary battles in American history. The camp stretched out for almost 3 miles along the west bank of the Little Bighorn River. As White Bull rode, he weaved through crowds of fleeing women and children. Everywhere, men scrambled to find their weapons and mount their horses and meet the attackers. Each of the different groups had their own section of the village. He rushed through the Arapaho and Cheyenne areas in the far north, then down into the various Sioux groups. His own family were with his wife's Sans Arc Lakota at the center. He stopped only for a moment to see that they were safely away before continuing on to where he was needed most. The Hunkpapa Sioux were encamped at the south end of the village, directly in the path of the attackers. Sitting Bull, the most respected leader among the village and the figurehead of their resistance to American expansion, would be there. White Bull urged his horse faster. He wasn't just any Lakota, after all. His father was a Minneconjou chief named Makes Room, and his mother was Goodfeather, the beloved sister of Sitting Bull. He had a special duty to protect his uncle. By the time he arrived, hundreds of warriors had already engaged the attackers, American soldiers, as he'd expected. These were the men of the 3 companies under Major Marcus Reno's command. Their bullets had torn through the teepees and claimed many lives already. Among them were faces he knew. Old Three Bears, for example, a respected man among White Bull's own Minneconjou, had already been felled. Sitting Bull's favorite horse had also been killed, but the man himself was mercifully unharmed. Sitting Bull spotted White Bull as he arrived and called out to him. "Get busy and do something," his uncle shouted. So White Bull kicked his horse and charged. The American firing line had stopped a few hundred feet from the edge of camp. Some native warriors dismounted to fire back, while White Bull and others remained on their mounts. White Bull opened fire with his rifle. The noise of gunfire and shouting all around him was deafening, and the air was thick with dust and smoke. It was hard to hit anything. He could see some of the Americans were kneeling, others riding. Among them he saw Arikara and Crow, enemy native tribes, aligned with the Americans, although unlike some of the other Sioux, he did not recognize their faces. The fighting was intense and bloody. Men he'd known for years fell in front of him. Dog with Horns, among the bravest of the Minneconjou despite his youth, was cut down mid-charge by the Americans a few feet from their line. This only enraged him. White Bull spotted the enemy's flag and shouted to his fellow warriors, "Whoever is a brave man will go get that flag." But by now, the ferocity of their counterattack had blunted the American advance. They began to break. The Americans retrieved their flag as the men on the firing line turned and ran for the cover of the timbers behind them. The Sioux cheered and gave chase to their fleeing enemy. What had once been a battle quickly became more like a buffalo hunt. The Sioux rode down the fleeing enemies, cutting them down with arrows and bullets as they scrambled back through the timbers and towards the river in retreat. As the Americans rushed to ford the river, they were easy pickings for the Native Americans on the banks. Several were shot down into the water or pulled from their horses and beaten to death. Their blood pooled in the water until the river ran red. Unfortunately, White Bull couldn't claim any kills by the time the enemy had been driven back over the river. But just as the first American attack had been repelled, he heard the warnings from behind. There was another, even larger attack coming to the north. White Bull realized that they'd been tricked. The fight in the south had been a distraction. White Bull and his fellow warriors had fallen for it, and now all of their families were directly in the path of the true enemy. White Bull turned his horse and rode north as fast as he could. Hundreds of warriors did the same. White Bull clung close to the river so he could get a good look at the Americans now riding across the hills to the northeast. There were hundreds of them. Custer actually had 5 companies with him, although White Bull could only distinguish 4 of them. He could tell that they were going to try forcing a crossing into the northern part of the village to seize the women and children as hostages. By the time White Bull arrived, the Americans were already trying to ford the river. Both sides exchanged gunfire across the water. Amidst the battle, White Bull saw one officer in particular wearing a buckskin coat and leading his men from the front. He seemed utterly fearless, despite being such an obvious target. Several other native accounts report a similar sight, and it is often speculated that this was Custer. White Bull joined the battle from the south at first. He opened fire on the American troops from some distance down the river. Specifically, he was in position to fire upon C Company under Custer's brother-in-law, Lieutenant James Calhoun. The Americans returned fire, and without any cover by the riverside, White Bull was forced to withdraw to a safer position. He rode east, up the hills on the far side of the river, eager to outflank his enemy. Dozens of warriors followed him. Down by the river, he could see the Americans had given up their attack and were now doing a fighting retreat back up the hillside. The tide had turned against them. As White Bull rode, he came across another group of Sioux trying to outflank Calhoun's men. They were led by Crazy Horse, perhaps the greatest warrior alive among the Sioux, and a good friend of his. They had ridden together into battle against the Americans at the Rosebud only a week earlier, and had not expected to enjoy the privilege again so soon. With the Americans already retreating, they could both already taste a victory in the air that would completely eclipse the Rosebud. White Bull felt himself worrying less about survival and more about glory. With a yell, he ordered his warriors to charge. Crazy Horse did the same. As they rode, White Bull turned to his friend and shouted, "Okay, hey, brother, this life will not last forever." The Americans were still moving steadily towards more defensible positions on the hills overlooking the Little Bighorn. White Bull and Crazy Horse took their warriors and ran in circles around them, firing wildly and paying no attention to the bullets flying back at them. The frightening display of hundreds of mounted warriors circling them was already breaking the spirit of those men. Some of the Americans tried to flee or threw down their weapons, begging for mercy. They didn't get it. White Bull spotted one rider alone. He kicked his horse and charged, but did not shoot the soldier. Among the Sioux, the greatest display of a warrior's skill was not to kill another man, but to count coup. This meant to touch another warrior in battle without necessarily killing them. It was a display of skill and power. It proved the warrior could get close enough to kill an enemy and escape again. Someone shot the soldier off his horse just before White Bull got to him. Still, the man was alive but terrified as the Lakota bore down on him. White Bull slowed his mount as he approached and leapt off to strike the other man on the chest with his horsewhip. "Oh, nay, I have overcome this one," he shouted. A few of the other Sioux cheered in recognition. Counting coup was only valid when other warriors could see it, after all. White Bull took the dead man's revolver and ammo as a prize and remounted to continue fighting. He rejoined Crazy Horse as they pursued the surviving Americans the rest of the way up the hill. Together, they singled out a lone trooper straggling behind the rest. The trooper tried to turn in his saddle to shoot White Bull and Crazy Horse as they closed in, but White Bull was alongside him before he could fire. He grabbed the trooper by his jacket and yanked him off the horse. The American screamed and shot into the air as he fell. Crazy Horse swooped in a second later and finished him off. Crazy Horse got the kill, but White Bull had the higher honor for counting coup first. White Bull would count several more coups soon enough. One he got from riding down a lone soldier with his horse. One brave trooper, already bleeding from a wound in his leg, stood alone, revolver in one hand and carbine in the other, holding back dozens of Native Americans. White Bull spotted him and circled him, coming in from behind and riding the trooper down before he even knew White Bull was there. He added another coup to his count. By now, the retreating troops had gathered at the top of the hills. Loose American horses were swarming around the battlefield, adding to the chaos and distracting some of the warriors who break off the attack to seize a few of the animals for themselves. White Bull took the opportunity to seize the reins of a passing horse for his own war prize. But immediately as he did so, there was a spurt of blood and a cry from his current horse. A bullet hit his horse's head, sending him to the ground. He lost the captured horse and his rifle in the confusion. Now on foot and armed with only his revolver and horsewhip, he needed to find an enemy and take his rifle. He spotted the nearest soldier at the same time the soldier spotted him. White Bull jumped to the side as the soldier fired. Miss. He was about to close the distance and knock the soldier to the ground when the soldier suddenly threw his rifle in White Bull's face and charged back at him. Suddenly, White Bull was on the ground. The American had him pinned and was raining desperate punches in his face. The American reached for his rifle, which had landed nearby, but White Bull managed to wrestle him away. The two men grappled on the ground as the battle raged around them. White Bull was strong, but he had underestimated the ferocity of his opponent. The soldier grabbed White Bull by his long hair and, with no other weapons available, tried to bite his nose off. White Bull had miscalculated. This man would surely kill him. "Hey, hey, come over and help me," he yelled, praying that someone would hear over the roar of the battle. Luckily, two fellow Lakota, Bear Lice and Crowboy, heard his cries and rushed to his aid. They beat the American with their clubs, although some of their blows landed on White Bull beneath him. It was enough to make the American lose his grip. White Bull broke free and struck the man in the head with the butt of his gun before finishing him off. It was a close call, and White Bull couldn't help but respect his fallen enemy. "He was a brave man and put up a good fight," he later said. White Bull took the dead man's rifle and ammo to rejoin the battle. By now, the Americans were down to their last stand. Crazy Horse had already swept over the men on Calhoun Hill. Only Last Stand Hill remained in American hands. The final soldiers put up a brave fight. They cut down dozens of Sioux and Cheyenne from their last position, using the bodies of men and horses alike as their final cover. There were no more than 30 or so of them left against an enemy who outnumbered them by about 50 to 1. "The army was crazy to have sent such a small band of soldiers against us anyway," White Bull reflected later. "They could never have beaten us in that fight." The Americans must have known that by the end, but they fought anyway. White Bull could say many things about the Americans, but he could never call them cowards. Inevitably, the Native Americans closed in. Like White Bull, many had armed themselves with the guns of their fallen enemies. Many of those Americans fell to weapons that had been in the hands of their comrades an hour before. The volume of fire pouring into the last Americans only increased, while the soldiers only dwindled. In a final desperate struggle to survive, a few of them tried to break out of the encirclement. White Bull and the other warriors quickly shot them down. He ran out among them and counted coup twice more. White Bull's fellow Miniconju, Red Horse, always wondered why the rest of the soldiers didn't come to Custer's aid. The whole time they were dealing with Custer, they expected Reno's men to rejoin the fight, to come up behind and take them by surprise. Had the soldiers not divided, I think they would have killed many Sioux, Red Horse said. The infamous orders Custer sent to Captain Benteen proved that the same thought occurred to him before the end, but those reinforcements would never come. Custer and his men would fight alone until the end. White Bull closed in on Custer's final position atop the hill, but partway up his ankle buckled and pain shot up his leg. White Bull fell to the ground. There was no wound, but something had gone wrong. Perhaps a glancing blow from a spent bullet, or maybe he damaged it falling from his horse and only now had the adrenaline worn off to let him feel it. Either way, walking was too painful. It wasn't as if White Bull would need to walk much longer, though. There were only 10 of them left by his count, now trapped on that hill. There would be no more chasing, no more retreats. Those men were going to die where they stood. Instead, White Bull crept over to a nearby ditch that gave him a firing line on the last Americans. From his position, he watched them fall one by one. The soldiers seemed tired, but they fought to the end, he said. The Americans were his enemy, but that did not mean that White Bull had not come to respect them. Among those final soldiers, White Bull thought he spotted the same officer in the buckskin coat who'd been leading the Americans across the river earlier in the battle. The officer was making his last stand with only his revolver in hand. The officer spotted White Bull in his position and fired 2 shots in his direction. Both missed. Then White Bull fired a single shot that brought him down. Many men would claim to be the one who killed Custer. White Bull did not realize who the man was at the time, but later he was convinced that the man he'd shot was, in fact, Custer. Barely an hour after it started, the fight was over. The last Americans fell, and Custer's last stand was over. It was a glorious battle, White Bull said. I enjoyed it. I was picking up head feathers right and left that day. Most of the other warriors quickly moved south once more to re-engage the soldiers on Reno Hill. Thanks to his wounded ankle, though, White Bull wasn't one of them. Instead, he waited for a friend to arrive with a horse to carry him back to camp for some healing. White Bull's family were glad to see him alive. Even Sitting Bull came and wrapped his nephew's wounded ankle in buffalo wool, allowing White Bull to proudly tell him of his deeds. He'd counted coups 7 times, killed 2 men in hand-to-hand combat, and survived his horse being shot out from under him. It was an impressive showing for any warrior. Still, Sitting Bull warned him against getting too arrogant. "Nephew," he said, "you had better be careful. One of these times you might get killed." After patching up his ankle, White Bull returned to the Custer battlefield. Most of the warriors were off dealing with Reno, leaving the battlefield eerily quiet. The dead were strewn across the grass, their empty eyes staring up at the open sky. White Bull did not see any mutilation when he walked among the bodies, no more than 2 or 3 hours after the battle. In time, almost every American would be scalped. He reckoned that this was done by families of the dead later in the evening as revenge for their fallen kin. He did loot some of the bodies, though, including 2 pairs of trousers, which he washed in the river to make a gift for his father. While at the battlefield, he found his relative Bad Soup also searching through the soldiers. As they walked to the top of Last Stand Hill, Bad Soup stopped and pointed to one body in particular. He had cut his distinctive blonde hair shortly before the battle, but the face of the man the Sioux knew as Long Hair Custer was still easy to recognize now. Someone had already stripped him, but his body would remain unmutilated until the Americans came for it a few days later. Longhair thought he was the greatest man in the world, Bad Soup said as they looked. Now he lies there. Later that evening, White Bull returned to battle by rejoining the attack on Reno Hill, but he did not consider the fight to be anything notable. With the Americans focusing purely on defense from their hastily fortified positions, there were few opportunities for glory. He remained there all night and into the next morning before returning to camp to sleep without any new glories to boast of. His father woke him later the following day with concerning news. Scouts had spotted strange activity far to the north, and White Bull needed to investigate. He mounted his horse, rallied a group of warriors to follow him, and went to investigate. They went about 10 miles before they spotted an American soldier, surely a scout for a larger force. Indeed, this was one of the scouts for Generals Alfred Terry and John Gibbon, who were on their way to a planned rendezvous with Custer. Soon, White Bull spotted the cloud of dust kicked up by the approaching column. A force that size was not likely to reach Sitting Bull's village before tomorrow, but when it did, it would pose a much bigger threat than Custer's misguided attack. White Bull rushed back to the village by sundown, but by then news of the approaching troops had already spread. People were already packing up their teepees and beginning to move out to the west. They had won the great victory that Sitting Bull had foretold, but now it was time to leave before the Americans repaid them with a crushing defeat. White Bull joined them, carrying with him one of the most exciting tales of the Battle of the Little Bighorn.